Welcome everyone, a great turnout, really appreciate it, and I know you're all keen and anxious to hear what's going on with the city, New York City, and how they come at their urban forests as a model. This has been sort of a very quick decision on Amory and my part. Amory Nagam is the key guy here who's been running around and sort of coordinating everything, and that's after a very successful summer internship placement through our Masters of Forest Conservation program with NYC, and so I think it inspired him to come back and say, hey, let's do something here, and I thought, yeah, this is really great. So Matthew Stevens is our first speaker in a series of 4 from New York City, Forestry, what's the official title here? Forestry, Horticultural and Natural Resources, I think that's the official title. And we'll do one each month, and we have the chief here next month on October 20th. I strategically planned that because of the big day a week later for us, which is October 27th. So I want to inspire some thinking about what we can do here if New York City can do what they're doing in their Million Tree Initiative. Just quickly, I won't drag much longer here. I wanted to introduce Matthew Stevens, Director of Street Tree Planting at New York City Department of Parks and Rec, so I guess there's different departments here. He's worked with the agency since 2007 and leads the citywide street tree planting program that is responsible for the planting of over 20,000 trees a year. He developed a block and community planting scheme that targets neighborhoods with high rates of childhood respiratory diseases and neighborhoods with few trees and green spaces. He also has improved the tree procurement process, and I'm keen to hear how that works for the city of New York City through establishing long-term contracts with local nurseries that help ensure better quality and diversity. Holds a BSc in horticulture from Illinois State University and MSc in public horticulture from the University of Delaware. As I wanted to acknowledge Leaf, there may be a Leaf rep here somewhere. Oh, Janet, there you are, thanks. And Geo, Green Infrastructure Ontario, who are both co-sponsoring with us. And so, welcome, Matthew.
But that's probably the New York City that everyone here knows and has visited. You know, Manhattan, the center, everyone knows the Arc, the Bronx, up in the very, very top, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island's down here. No one really cares about Staten Island. If I offended any Staten Islanders, I apologize. But ultimately, New York City is a tough place for trees, right? Trees in New York City are sort of a juxtaposition that they don't always go hand in hand. And we know that because of how trees are in the urban environment, they're constantly under this stress. That there's like a constant, there's constant things that make it harder for trees to survive there. Some of it's development, right? This happens all across the, all across the world. Trees never seem to come out on top when it comes to buildings. But this map up here sort of indicates those locations where there's been this canopy change. New York City at a very high level knows where there used to be trees and where there's no longer trees. And so the red areas are areas where there's been trees lost. And each of those red areas is often tied to development. But other crazy stuff the trees have to face are, city agencies sometimes. Crazy, people vandalizing trees. And certainly storms. From what I gathered, everyone's very familiar with ice storms over the last year. We've been fortunate enough to have hurricanes, not ice storms, but nonetheless still very devastating. And then there's just like weird stuff. Right? There's the tree that eats signs down on Greenpoint Avenue. There's the trees that someone turned into a terrarium. And then one of my personal favorites is a Brooklyn Bridge replica tree garden. So we'll play that again, just because. And maybe just one more time. The beauty of New York City is, I mean, the good and bad thing is that there's certainly crazy people. There's crazy people everywhere. I think there's more crazy people perhaps in New York. But there's good people too, right? This is a neighbor who's concerned about their trees, that saw their neighbor doing something they shouldn't be doing and decided to help us out, right? And this one video is in itself an act of stewardship. You know, that we're always on the lookout for these types of people who go above and beyond the everyday to take care of, help us care for the urban forest. On a side note, one of, you know, these are the great cases for us because it's so clear what happened. There's, you know, you can't deny that you weren't the person in the video shaking the tree. And you know, subsequently, we have a system of fines for people who do obvious vandalism that we're ready, willing, and able to enforce. But tree planting is what we're going to talk about today. So, New York City Parks, over the last couple of decades, has planted trees every year. Right, we've been actually planting trees throughout New York City since the early 1900s to some degree. Ever since the 90s, we've started to track it more consistently and in a more sophisticated way. But ultimately, what this chart represents is that tree planting sort of ebbed and flowed for years. And then something changed in 2007. All right, and I'll take a moment to point to the blue box. The blue box is a larger environmental initiative that came down from City Hall. And prior to that initiative, Parks has been doing a lot of research. We had counted all of our trees in 2005. We've done a full street tree census. We've been using that information, gathering that information, organizing that information to be able to present it at the right time, at the right place, with the right people. And I'll probably come back to the right time, at the right place, with the right people a few times, because this one moment in time is what changed tree planting in New York City. From a sheer numbers point, we started planting 4 or 5 times as many street trees as we've ever had prior. So, you know, on any given year, we're planting 20 to 25,000 trees. Every single year, we plant in 2 seasons, similar to Toronto in spring and fall. But ultimately, 1 million trees was a change. It offered us a chance to redefine the work we did. And so we're currently, whatever the ticker is up there, a little over 900,000 trees planted. We'll be planting the 1,000,000th tree in the spring of 2015. Everyone here is invited. I can only house 1 or 2 people in my apartment before you all decide to come down. But we'd love to have it, right? And for New York City, it is the end and the beginning of something significant. It's the end of planting 1,000,000 trees over the course of about 7 years. And it's the start of this whole new world, this whole new culture, this whole new tree awareness within New York City. The pictures here are part of what's gone into revamping trees within New York City. Big Bird somehow is part of that picture. But the reality of our work has changed because of some of the publicity we've brought to our work. Right? Instead of sort of planting trees as we've always done, we're now more strategic about when we open our doors and when we share the work we're doing with the public. And that has changed the tree culture within New York City greatly. All of it's planted by contractors. None of it is volunteers for streets. The reforestation trees are all planted by volunteers and contractors. So, fall 2007, we aggregate all this information, we figure out what we're going to do, we come to the table prepared to be able to discuss what we want to do, and first question we get asked is, where are you going to have all the money? What are you going to do with it? And the city had for about 30 years, had a free tree planting program. So anyone, anywhere in the city could request a new tree to be planted in front of their house, in front of their school, in front of their nemesis house if they know they don't care for trees. And so that that service we wanted to continue. It's very democratic, right? So you'd be able, anyone with a phone or internet connection can request a tree anywhere throughout the city. That's amazing city service. But the second layer of that is that we knew that with additional funding, we'd be able to fulfill each of those requests, and then there'd be money left over. And so with the leftover money, we thought, how are we going to go about planting trees? And we thought about this question really, really, really hard because we knew it would come under a lot of scrutiny. And so the map on the right, that just shows where tree requests are coming in, right? It probably happens in every city that if you have a free tree planting request program, there's certain density, certain neighborhoods request more trees than others, right? And those neighborhoods are no surprise, they're white, educated, make $80,000 more a year, usually families. But there's a lot not covered, right? You know, the dark green areas are those dense tree request areas. And we wanted to think about, well, what about everyone else? And so we thought really carefully, well, let's take tree canopy, because we know where there's canopy, where there's not canopy. Let's take where there's high population densities, where there's a lot of people. And let's take childhood asthma rates of all things. So when you take those three things, I can't do it, but our GIS whizzes somehow can. They put those all into a computer and now outputs a map. So the map on the right is that map. The darker areas are higher need neighborhoods, the lighter areas are lower need. Higher need would indicate less tree canopy, higher population density, and higher occurrence of childhood asthma. And what that ends up, once put it on a map, we ended up with a few different neighborhoods that stood out for one reason or another. And knowing that we're trying to bring a greater awareness to our work, we said, well, we're gonna brand these neighborhoods differently. We're gonna call these neighborhoods different because they are different, because they have lower canopy, they have higher densities, they have higher rates of childhood asthma. They're called trees for public health neighborhoods. So we started with each of those neighborhoods, one in every single borough, so no one gets left out. We did 2 up in the Bronx. And what did we do there? So we started, we call it block planting, where we looked at a block and said, we want to plant trees here. And we're going to plant trees up and down both sides of the streets every 30 or 40 feet. The picture on the left is basically what it looks like when it's done. The map on the right indicates where that's been completed over the last 5 or 6 years. And so street by street, block by block, Parks was now fulfilling every request that it received, and then also going into neighborhoods that had low tree canopies, high population densities, high rates of childhood asthma, and planting trees in a very dense way. And we planted regardless of whether the property owner wanted it or not. I'll pause there on purpose because some people love trees, some people despise trees with every bone in their body. I have been called all sorts of crazy, terrible things for trying to plant trees in people's neighborhood, unfortunately. But for whatever reason, people view trees as a liability, and it's going to cause them a burden. In New York City, where there's already so many burdens, I'm going to have to clean up after the leaves, I'm going to have to clean up after the dogs, it's going to go into my sewer pipes, it's going to make my education bills for my kids higher, and like all sorts of crazy stuff that doesn't make sense. But we decided, and this was a policy that we worked very closely with City Hall to get the sign off on before we started, that there would be a no rejection policy. Because we're planting that tree for the benefits of everyone on this block, not just the one person that didn't want it. And really what it came down to is it's a very slippery slope to let one person determine whether benefits would be provided to their block or not. And so we decided on that very firm rule. And as you can imagine, it is very transformative. Many of the blocks that we started with in these neighborhoods looked exactly like this. Maybe there's one tree, maybe there's 2 trees somewhere on the block, but for the most part we have a blank slate. And it's not tens of blocks that were like this, it was literally hundreds of blocks where there was not a single tree. And this is about 3 years later. And this is about 6 years later. And so block after block, there's a change happening. Fast forward, we'll get 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 50 years from now, 80 years from now, I'll come back with the same presentation with the pictures. But one reason I do like this particular set of pictures, we have these for a lot of neighborhoods, is that we randomly sort of send people out. And for whatever reason, the 2 out of the 3 times we sent someone out there, these are like construction utility trucks here. And for whatever reason, a few years later, there's still construction going on at that same site. And I know things are slow in New York, but I think what it sort of paints a picture of is that there's this constant stress on our trees, right? That there's always something that is competing with the trees, whether it's people, it's trucks, construction, whatever. So before we started, we spent a lot of time really thinking about if we're going to do this, we're going to do this the right way, and what do we need? And so someone, before we announced that we're going to plant 1 million trees, someone actually asked, are there 1 million trees out there? That's government, that's good government. And we thought, really, well, we knew what we had done in the past. And so when someone asked, are there 1 million trees available, we said no. And we said no for a few different reasons. That parks in the past had relied on tree planting contractors to find the material and had very speckled success with it. Are there any nursery people in that room? So I won't offend anyone. Does anyone ever shopped for trees at a nursery where you're tagging trees? Has anyone ever heard the term park grade tree? Park grade tree is like the shitty tree no one else wanted to take. And Parks was getting a lot of park grade trees. For a lot of reasons, right? We weren't as intimately involved in the procurement process as we should have. That there were a few tree brokers that were sort of meddling, that were making things a little bit more difficult than it should have. And ultimately, Parks wasn't in the driver's seat. And so someone finally asked us this question: if you really want to do your job really well, what would you need? And we said no. There aren't 1 million trees out there. Because for decades, literally decades, we hadn't been getting the trees that we wanted. We hadn't been getting the right species, the right diversity, and we hadn't been getting the right quality. And so the next question was like, well, then what would it take And our immediate answer was a contract to grow trees. That we really felt strongly that this was the solution to fix this one problem that our forest was having. And so we went through the whole process, we put together contracts, we figured out what type of trees we want, went out to the nursery industry and said, we want to purchase a bunch of trees for the next 10 years. And that got like a lot of nursery people's attention, right? Because they're like, this could be good money for us. So we gave everyone the contract, worked with them and answered their questions. Bid day comes, and I'm so excited, months and months of work. This is going to be a game changer. We're going to change the way we do work, and no one bid. So that was disappointing, to say the least. But what then happened is we reached out to the nurseries, asking, well, what's going on? You picked up the contract. We want to purchase a lot of trees. This seems like something you'd be interested in. Like, why aren't you interested? And we got back a lot of different things. Ultimately, it was a little too risky for nurseries. Part of it also was how we were going about it. No Trees usually aren't sold with a contract. Tree nurseries are for farmers, right? And trees are usually sold with a handshake and a promise that you pay them, not a 200-page document on what's required. And so I think that really scared a lot of nursery men and women off. So we changed a few things, rebid it out, and then ended up with a couple nurseries that were willing to help us out. And so now we said, all right, this is great. Now we know where our trees are going to come from. We're going to have these two nurseries to grow trees for us. And this is what we were after. But it also allowed us the first time ever to really develop a much more intimate relationship with our nurseries. We had always only gone to the nurseries once or twice a year, and that was right before spring planting season and right before fall planting season. And at the same time, we were going there, with a tree planting contractor who was paying them. Parks was never paying the nursery directly. And so we were shown park-grade trees. We were never shown all the trees that they had on the nursery, maybe just a sampling of what they wanted to get rid of. And ultimately, these contracts put Parks in the driver's seat, right? It allowed us to watch the trees from the moment they were planted to the time that they were harvested. And that has really brought an amazing amount of benefits for our program. We're now able to get a lot of quality standards that we never got before. A couple quick samples. Who can recognize the tree in the picture on the left? Tree ID quiz, keep everyone on their toes. It is a European hornbeam. So 99% of the time, the tree on the left is sold limb down to the ground, sold for estates or as a hedge. It actually happens to be a tough, durable tree, and we figured we want more of this tree in our urban forest. So can you limit up for us? And we'll take those. The other thing that it really refined is the root ball package. This is an item that Parks has really invested a lot of time, and a lot of the contract was dedicated to this, because our trees get shipped to the city, unloaded, reloaded onto a truck, taken out. If there's a garbage truck or a traffic jam, the tree comes back, gets unloaded, gets reloaded. Like, the trees get handled a few more times than is normal. And having a very tight, uniform package, we know, and research has shown, that the more times you handle a tree, the more likely it is to affect overall health or mortality. And then the other thing is tree planting. So when the trees are first planted, making sure that they get planted at the right height, but also when they're dug, that you get the right size root ball. So in New York City, we planted 2.5 to 3 inch caliper tree. I'm not sure what that is in millimeters, but it's about the size of that. ANSI nurseryman standards indicate that a 2.5 to 3 inch tree should be in a 28 to 32 inch root ball. Because Parks wasn't paying for the trees, landscape contractors were paying for the trees, and we have strict productivity requirements in our contract. What we ended up noticing is that a lot of the trees we were getting was this over here. So we're getting park grade tree in a smaller root ball so that more trees can be fit on the truck. And in this big scheme of things, maybe it's only 4 to 8 inches, but what we've seen is a great increase in tree health and a great reduction in tree mortality. Another thing that came out of it is this. What can you tell about this picture? What's going on? Certainly we know this is not a supermarket, right? This is a tree nursery. What other cues exist in the picture to tell you what's going on? The wire cages in the background with burlap, right? So that sort of indicates that trees are close to being harvested, that they're going to be dug soon. See that the trees are dormant. And here's one very, very big item that Parks definitely was not digging before. So before you dig a tree, well, first of all, you have to make sure, the aim that we're trying to get at is to make sure that the root flare is at the top of the root ball. That is the simplest explanation of what we're trying to get here. And what ends up happening in nurseries is they mound up soil around the base of the tree, and you ask them why they do it, and they give you a bunch of like screwball answers that don't make sense to you as an urban forester. So you wonder, well, if that's what you're going to do, we're going to require you to remove this before you dig the tree. And you have to do it before you dig the tree for this reason. So the tree on the left, over here, our left, did not have the soil removed. The tree on the right did have the soil removed before digging. And everyone likely knows that when you dig a tree, you get maybe 5 to 7% of the total roots of that tree, right? You're not getting very much, but when you don't clean off the soil on top of that, you're getting even fewer. And I definitely don't have a PhD, but I definitely can tell you there's more roots on the bottom tree than on the top tree. We've done this dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of times over, and it is the same result every single time. And so I walk you through these examples to sort of highlight that Parks was now dictating what quality standards were and how trees should be grown and delivered to New York City. So this is what we hope shows up. They're all lined up like little soldiers, maybe not ready for battle, but ready for planting throughout the city. And then the other aspect of what has changed is our diversity. So now that we're specifying, well, this is what we want for quality, it also left this big question, well, what do you want us to actually grow? And none of the, most nursery men or women guess, because they're planting trees 3 to 5, 6 years before they're going to sell them. So they're always thinking, what am I going to sell 3 to 6 years from now? And it's a big giant guess. And so we told them exactly what we wanted. And what we knew we wanted is a much greater diversity of trees. And over the years, we've increased. I think we're over close to 240 different types of trees that we're planting in a single year. 240 trees at the cultivar level. It's not all unique species, it's to the cultivar level. So we plant 1 or 2 different types of honey locust, 1 or 2 different types of elms, etc., etc. But nonetheless, we've expanded the palette of trees that we're planting by 7 or 8 times. And here's a list of trees that we never, ever, ever, ever got before, but I can now take you to a field and show you hundreds. And this list of trees comes from those trees that we knew we wanted to plant more of, but were never available. And so each of these trees now, I can take you to the trees we're going to be planting in the fall, in a couple weeks. I can take you to the trees that we'll be planting next year, and the year after, and some of them even the year after. And so this is actually about the same time as that initial picture, the mid-40s. Aside from these 2 very suspicious men at the bottom here, because my guess is no one knows where this is at, but it's on Rikers Island. Has anyone ever been to Rikers Island? It is a maximum security prison currently, so I hope no one's been there. But up until the 80s, it was a tree nursery. So Parks used to grow its own trees for park projects or for street trees. And when you look at that picture, it's tough to make out what's there. But what is really clear, if you look very closely, is that there's only 2 types of trees in that picture. The very bottom is oriental plane tree, of which Parks used to plant tons and tons. and in the very back is American elm. And so when you look at this picture, this is 2 acres, maybe 3 acres of land with 2 different types of trees being grown. Those sort of indicate the 2 different types of trees. But those trees went somewhere, right? And our past records, they're not the best, so we're not sure which trees got planted at which seasons fully. But we do know what's out there. So in 1995, 2005, we did a census of all the trees, counted about 600,000 street trees throughout New York City. And then we said, well, this is what we have, right? If you're looking at your cards, like this is what we have. And what we realized is that we have a few problems. Looking, the X's are those census numbers, right? And the few different colors here are different years of tree planting. What we do know, a few years that we've tracked down, is that some years, a very narrow range of species was planted. And they have become the banes of our existence: elms, maples, plane trees, lindens, and oaks. Those were the 5 genera that were planted on the most regular basis, over and over and over and over. And so we asked ourselves, now that we're going to control quality, and now we know what we have in the urban forest, what do we want to plant? And that question we thought really hard about. Because with this mechanism now in place to be able to plant whatever we wanted, we're no longer at the mercy of what the market was providing. We could answer that question. And so we decided on a few things. That we definitely want to fix a few problems. That we know we have a bunch of trees where there's lots of them, and we have way more of them than what we're comfortable with. So for example, maples and plane trees and pears, we definitely don't want to be planting 12, 13% pear anymore. But we definitely don't want to be planting 25% maple. The maple breakdown is a combination of silver maple and Norway maple, both of which we don't really plant at all anymore, but we're planted in massive amounts over the 40s, 50s, 60s. We're not planting 5% of any, more than 5% of any one individual tree, and in some instances, in some species, like oaks, we're actually only planting 1% or 2% of each type of trees. So this is broken down to the genus level, but the reality is this Quercus bar is comprised of about 17 different species of oaks. And so almost every single tree we're planting now, we're planting somewhere between 1 and 2% max. There's only a handful that we're planting 3, 4, 5%. And we're doing this with the hopes of managing our urban forest, that eventually, if this line is what we're planting generally, and we keep planting that season after season after season after season, the population will start to reflect what we're planting, right? If you keep planting the same quantities, same percentages each year, that over time the population will slowly start to reflect, but it's going to take a ton of time. We're not talking years, we're talking decades. For all the Norway maple, the craft Norway maples sort of floating around out there, it's going to be another 30 or 40 years before they're all finally moved, because each storm, knocks a few more out. Throughout the year, they naturally decline. But inevitably, they're going to be around for a very, very long time. And so these species prescriptions, this is what we're calling this prescribing what's being planted, is one of the long-term management policies that has come out of growing trees. We're going to be planting a wide mix and wide diversity of trees throughout the state. This is actually New York City. This is not all of our planting sites, but this is some of our planting sites. This is A nightmare to navigate, obviously. I love that some of the pipes are just like propped up with wood, if you can see in the background. I guess that's how infrastructure in New York City works. But ultimately, it is a very complicated mix of plant trees. And our process is pretty simple, straightforward. You know, all of the trees we hand select at the nursery by a trained forester. That's really important for us. The other thing, every tree, when it's delivered, a forester is there. So when the tree's coming from outside of the city into the city, there's a trained forester at that delivery to make sure that the right trees are showing up, the trees that they selected in the field are actually the trees showing up, that they're handled properly by the tree planting contractor, and that there's no issues that occurred with tree digging. The picture on the upper right hand indicates that each site is marked by a trained forester. How big the tree bed is going to be, what species is going to go there. All the trees have the full tree bed excavated, fill soil is removed, and new fresh topsoil is brought in. And of course, everyone knows how to plant a tree, and this is generally what the finished product looks like. Everyone always wants to know how it works. This is a very, very, very basic map to sort of help visualize how we decide which trees go where. So if we're planting 240 different types of trees, where do they all go? And as I'm sure you probably caught on a couple of my pictures, you see some blocks. The transformative block, the silver lindens from earlier, the 3 pictures that transition, that was all the same species on one block, right? And what Parks has decided is that one block does not constitute a monoculture. Certainly an entire neighborhood, block after block after block of the same species, perhaps could be classified as a monoculture. But now that we have this diversity, we diversify at the block level. And so each one of these colors would reflect a different planting palette. So maybe the purple are Zelkovas, maybe the red is a combination of honey locust and Kentucky coffee tree. Maybe the blue is a mixed bag of species. And so on a block by block level, each forester, before they start planting, as they're completing the survey process, they look at the neighborhood at a block level, or at a neighborhood level. And they think about the tree diversity at that neighborhood level, not necessarily always at a block level. And so some streets end up like this, right, where it's the same species on both sides of the street, but the next block over would be something different. The next block further over would be something different as the colors try to correspond. So again, you're all invited in next spring to come help us plant the millionth tree. And really our next steps are what happens to the trees now. Now that we've planted 1 million trees, they're gonna grow and they're gonna need maintenance and they're gonna need care, right? Trees are like cars. They need maintenance every few thousand miles to keep them properly running and keep them safe. So that's really how 1 million trees is transitioning. Certainly we'll continue to plant trees. Part of a healthy urban forest is a constant planting of trees every season or year. But the next step then is to sort of leverage what we've learned to track down resources for long-term tree care and maintenance to ensure these trees are properly cared for. I think with that, I'll say I'm done, and we'll see if we have any questions.